It is sad when the person responsible for protecting the congregation is also the person protecting the predator. What happens when a father, a pastor, a regional church leader knows exactly what his son has done, and instead of holding him accountable, hands him a title, a platform, and a building full of families? That's not a hypothetical. That is what happened at Calvary Spokane, Washington. And we have the receipts. Calvary Spokane is one of the largest churches in eastern Washington. It's been led by the same man for nearly all of its 45 years, Pastor Ken Ortize, now 77 years old. Ken didn't build this church from nothing. He came from Calvary Chapel Costa Mesa in California. The church founded by Chuck Smith, the grandfather of the entire Calvary Chapel movement. Ken brought that verse-by-verse preaching model to Spokane, and it worked. By 1995, the Associated Press was reporting Calvary Spokane as the city's largest congregation, with around 3,000 attendees. Ken also became the regional director for the Calvary Chapel Association, a network of roughly 1,800 churches. He had reach, reputation, and institutional power. And then there's his son, Ben Ortize. Ben is 53 years old. He has spent most of his adult life inside his father's church. And earlier this year, Ken elevated Ben to associate pastor, second in command over all staff at a 2,000-member congregation. When that announcement came, people didn't celebrate, they revolted. Why? Because many of them knew the history. And it is a history Ken Ortize has spent decades trying to manage, contain, and ultimately ignore. In 1998, an 18-year-old woman named Tawny Atherton started attending Calvary Spokane, just 2 weeks after her high school graduation. Ben Ortize was 26. He asked her on a date. 3 weeks later, he proposed. 8 months later, they were married. Even within the Ortize family, this raised serious concerns. Beth Thompson, Ken and Jamie's oldest daughter, Ben's own sister, told the Roy's report, "I remember saying to my brother, 'You're a cradle robber. What are you doing dating somebody that young?' She was a baby, very naive." Now hold that thought. An 18-year-old girl brand new to the church, singled out by the pastor's son, a man 8 years her senior, swept into a marriage in under a year. That dynamic alone should have triggered scrutiny from church leadership. Instead, Ben was already on staff, already being groomed, signed according to former elder Dan McMahon, to one day take over from his father. What happened after the honeymoon is, according to Tawny's own sworn testimony in a 15-hour divorce proceeding in September 2024, nothing short of horrific. Ben allegedly commanded his teenage wife to get on her knees and bark like a dog to prove her love. She begged him not to make her do it. He insisted. He preached against corn from the pulpit, while forcing his wife to watch pornographic films at home, telling her she needed to learn how to please him. Over the course of their marriage, Tawny described escalating SA that I won't detail exhaustively. But that included acts so physically damaging she required rectal surgery in 2002. She had that surgery while Ben was out of the country on a mission trip. She told the court she lived in fear of his anger. She said she learned to comply, like, in her words, a caged animal. He monitored her phone. He monitored her computer. He called her names I won't repeat on this channel. And she didn't tell anyone for years. Not because she didn't want to, but because she said she didn't understand that what was happening to her wasn't normal. Let that sink in. She had been brought into this church world at 18, married to a pastor's son, isolated, monitored, and systematically conditioned to believe that what she was enduring was just marriage. By the late 2000s, Ben had been promoted to executive pastor at Calvary Spokane, despite serious, documented concerns from the church's elders. Former elder Dan McMahon told the Roy's report, "Ben was always, in a sense, fighting us in the board meetings." Ben also ran an intense discipleship program called Heart for Ministry, HFM. Former participants described being required to submit totally to Ben's authority, logging 10-hour days and facing control unlike anything they had experienced in ministry before. "I've never seen that kind of control," said one former HFM member. Eventually, the elders had had enough. They decided Ben needed to go. They planned to fire him. But Ken intervened. Instead of allowing the board to do its job, Ken brokered a quiet exit, sending Ben to take over a Calvary Chapel affiliate in Sandpoint, Idaho, 72 miles away. Ken even, according to divorce court testimony, withdrew 3 months' worth of church salary funds from Calvary Spokane to help Ben get started in Sandpoint. Former elders McMahon and Craig Leone told the Roy's report they were not informed about the use of church funds for this. Tawny described the moment she overheard Ken and Ben discussing the plan. Ken saw it as a way to get rid of the problem, she said. Ben saw it as an escape route. No one at Calvary Spokane was told why Ben was leaving. No one in the Sandpoint congregation was told about his disciplinary history. Two congregations were deceived, so one family could avoid accountability. At Grace Sandpoint, Ben continued the same patterns. Rapid firings, control, and corn found on a church computer. Abusive leadership documented by those who worked closely with him. At one point, things at Calvary Spokane were bad enough, even with Ben technically gone, that a pastor named Scott Douglas from Cabinet Mountain Calvary Chapel was called in to investigate. He interviewed elders, staff, and Ken himself. He wrote a 15-page letter to Ben detailing his findings. In that letter, Douglas concluded that Ben had exploited people, retaliated with false accusations, and created a pattern of abusive leadership. But Douglas also identified where the rot started. He wrote, and I'm drawing directly from the Roy's report's coverage here. When he asked Ken how Ben ended up as a senior pastor of a church plant and why the church put so much money into his startup costs, Ken's reply was, quote, "Because he's my son." That's it. That was the defense. Because he's my son. Douglas also noted he wasn't convinced Ken was genuinely sorry. Years later, when Tawny's divorce attorney introduced Douglas's report as evidence, Ken took the stand and effectively disowned it. He said he didn't remember speaking with Douglas for a report. He said some of his quotes didn't sound like him. A report written to hold his son accountable. And years later, the father sat in a courtroom and tried to bury it. In 2013, Ben raised money from his under 100-member Idaho church to buy remote property in Blue Creek, Montana, 35 miles from Sandpoint, and started Blue Creek Bible College. No cell service, no internet. Former students described it as cultish. High labor demands. High turnover. Total control. In 2018, Tawny disclosed the essay to members of Ben's congregation, the Kuchensky family. She emailed them on January 3rd, describing what she had endured and her attempts to confront Ben, made only to be lectured for hours about her selfishness and accused of listening to an evil spirit. The Kuchenskys took her and her children to a shelter that day. She only stayed a week, because her children struggled, and because the marriage counselor she was sent to, Pastor Tim Remington of Coeur d'Alene, consistently redirected blame back onto her. As she described it, "Now tell me what he did. Now this is why it's your fault, Tawny." When she returned home, the essay got worse. Church elders eventually put Ben and Tawny on a sabbatical. But what happened after the sabbatical is one of the most gut-wrenching parts of this story. Tawny recanted. Facing enormous pressure from her husband and her pastor, she stood before the congregation and took it all back. And according to former student Aaron Kuchensky, this is how she explained her earlier disclosure. She told everyone she had been possessed by a demon. Kyle Huffman, a former student who had been placed in charge of the school during the sabbatical and had filed a recommendation to close it and conduct an audit, said he didn't believe her public statement. He warned a church elder that SAED women often return to AB users when the cost of leaving is too high. Not long after, Ben's elders told Aaron Kuchensky, the man who had helped get Tawny and her children to safety, that unless he repented of everything he believed about Tawny, he was no longer welcome at the church. He was kicked out for believing an SAED victim. In 2020, during COVID, Tawny began pushing to sell the Blue Creek property. She was exhausted. In January 2022, it sold for $3.4 million. And the church immediately purchased a $1.4 million parsonage in Coeur d'Alene for the Ortize family. In February 2022, while Ben was on a trip with their children, Tawny made her final break, with help from a former police officer. She filed her handwritten divorce petition on February 15, 2022. The case dragged on for 3 years, with Ben's side arguing in court that she had cheated, neglected their children's education, and endangered them while driving. Tawny denies all of it. In February 2025, the court dissolved the marriage. Ben received full legal custody with shared physical custody. And sometime last fall, while the divorce was still being litigated, Ken Ortize brought Ben back to Calvary Spokane as an administrator. In January 2025, he promoted him to associate pastor over all staff. This is the moment I want to pause on. Ken Ortize, who had seen the Douglas report. who had heard Tawny's testimony in court, who had watched elders try to fire his son in 2009, who had watched a Bible college shut down under his son's leadership, who had watched staff resign and be fired at church after church, looked at all of that and decided the right move was to put Ben in charge of people. Former volunteer Lizzie Sarton put it plainly. They knew his transgressions, they knew his history, they knew his past, then placed him in a building with families. Here is what this story is, at its core. It is a story about how institutional protection of the family can override every pastoral obligation to a congregation. It is a story about how a father with regional denominational power used that power, not to protect the vulnerable, but to protect his son's access to ministry positions, to people, to authority. It is a story about how victims are silenced, not always with threats, but sometimes with counselors who redirect blame, with congregations who demand recantations, with communities that punish the people who believe survivors. And it is a story that is not over. Ben Ortize is at Calvary Spokane right now. Ken Ortize has not publicly responded. This is part 1 of a 2-part series on this story. I will be covering part 2 when it is published. If you found this video important, please share it. Not for the algorithm, but because there are people in that congregation and connected to that church who need to know this story exists. See, subscribe if you want to stay updated. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And as always, accountability is not an attack on the church, it is part of how the church heals. I'll see you in the next one.